Alright, so now that you've seen the game in action, let's talk about how this Gems and Baddies graphics game is going to come together. So here what I've got is I've got an image of my gem, what eventually I imagine my baddies will look like, and what my player eventually will look like. So rather than the colored squares that you saw in that first video, you might have some cool images later on, and you can pick to have yours look and be skinned however you would like. Alright, so what's the objective of this game? Well, the user's going to control the player using the keyboard. Their job is to avoid the bad guys and collect the gems in order to stay alive. Like we saw in that video, if the player is caught by a baddie, meaning they collide with one another, the player is going to lose a life and get reset to the start location. If a player collects a gem, they will gain 2 lives, and eventually that can be up to you of how many lives they will gain, and the gem is going to respawn somewhere else on the board. Notice, however, though, the baddies don't move. If you collide with a baddie, they are undisturbed. They could care less about that collision. Therefore, they don't move. But if you collect a gem, then that gem's going to disappear and respawn somewhere else so that you can go collect new ones. All right, so let's think about how this structure might work out. This is a lot of text all at once, but let's talk through it. During first semester, we learned about the idea of objects. When we wanted to have a lot of things on that graphic window with moving parts, that was calling for the need for objects. We started by looking at that idea of a ball object so that we could have many shapes bouncing around on our graphic screen. So we know from that video that there are going to be lots of gems and lots of baddies on the screen. And they have an X and Y position, they've got a size, they've got a color or an image, so those definitely should be objects for us. And I can already start to imagine that those might be some of the variables that are involved in those objects. But what about the player? We only have one player, so as far as having a lot and the need there, we don't really need our player to be an object. It could just be player variables of where's the player's X position and Y position and things like that. However, if you decided later on that you wanted to make this game 2-player, you'd have a lot of variables to add and a lot more to be working through. So we would be quite sad to have to add that second player. If our player was an object, adding in a second player would be not that big of a deal. Also, the player could have some functions to it as far as what does it mean to reset, what does it mean to collide, and throwing all of that logic into the main part of our graphics game is just not our ideal version of programming. So in order to help keep things separated, we're going to also make our player be an object. So in total, 3 objects, 1 for the player, 1 for the gems, 1 for the baddies. So let's look at what those objects are going to look like. Our gems are our most simple object. They just need a bunch of variables. So our gems are containers for variables. They need an X, a Y, a color, or maybe later on an image, a size variable, and then some value. Reason I'm putting this value here is later on in your game, maybe you want it to be that some gems have different values than others, so you can have special gems so that not all increase lives by 2. Some are 1, some are 5, some are 10, whatever you want it to be, maybe. So having that value there might be helpful. For our baddies, we're going to have that same idea of the structure of the different variables. So an X, a Y, a color, and a size. Maybe that color later on will be an image. And for our bad guys, we have some damage that needs to be done. I should stop saying bad guys. We're going to call them baddies. For our baddies, we have some damage. And what that is basically the opposite of value. It's what the baddies will take away from the player's life. So how many lives will they decrement from the player if they are collided with? And the baddies need some kind of a method in order to be able to move. If you noticed in the game, they were moving along some specified paths, so they needed some way to be able to move throughout their game. Lastly, we have the player. So the player is going to have that same kind of structure of variables. In AP, you will talk about the fact that when all of these objects have similar structures of variables, there's actually a better way to do this, but that wasn't something that we covered this year, so we'll leave inheritance for AP Computer Science if you're headed that way, or Google it up if you're interested. So in that case, we would have an X, a Y, a color/image, maybe later on, a size for our player, and then the amount of lives that the player has. We want to keep track of how many lives have they gained via gems or lost via baddies, or how are they doing as far as the number of lives left. The player also needs to be able to check for that kind of collision. The player is going to hopefully be colliding with a lot of gems and hopefully not be colliding with a lot of baddies. So in order to check for that collision, we probably should have a method there. And we also know that that player, when colliding with baddies, ends up getting reset to their starting position. So we'll probably want to create a reset method. All right, and those are all of our objects that we're going to make. So in the next video, we're going to jump into making those objects.